next up we're going to take a look at the SQL Workshop. A couple of the things we'll touch on. These are all the main components of the SQL Workshop. So what is the SQL Workshop? Again, it's just a web-based interface to your database. Those of you who are familiar with MySQL are perhaps familiar with MyAdmin or PHP MyAdmin. Basically the same idea, a web-based interface to the database. In fact, with MySQL, most people never know of another means to interact with the database. In Oracle, there are lots of tools to interact with the database, starting with SQL Plus, the command line interface. And then people also use tools like Toad or these days SQL Developer to do work in the database, such as create tables and do other things of that nature. With Apex, we have a complete development environment. So you don't need to go to one of those other tools. But one of those other tools is often going to do the job better. But if you don't have one, and or you're just in a situation where you don't have access to one at a particular time, then the SQL Workshop can be very powerful, basically allowing you to do anything the other tools do, just often not as easily. 5 main components we'll find in the SQL Workshop. On the left of the image above, we see the object browser. That basically allows us to both view and make changes to various database objects. We have the SQL commands window. Think of that as the online version of SQL Plus, the command line tool. SQL scripts allows us to execute scripts against the database. That's a lot like the SQL commands window, only it's a collection of statements that are designed to be executed as a set rather than individually. Next tool, the Query Builder, can be very powerful. If you're not too comfortable working with SQL yet, you can use the Query Builder to build simple and even quite complex queries to be executed against the database. You can even save and reuse them. And then we have a utility section now that offers a wide variety of utilities, perhaps the most important of which is the ability to import and export data. We also have user interface defaults. We'll get into that here in a little bit. Let's talk some about the object browser. This tool allows you to maintain underlying database objects. It has a declarative interface, which is powerful. And it's different than the next part we'll be looking at, the SQL Workshop, the SQL commands window, in that we can see things and create using a tool graphically, but it also gives us the code, which is a really important point that a lot of people miss. And I'm going to make sure I show you that here in just a moment, because oftentimes we need the code if we're putting together deployment scripts or things of that nature. The object browser has a couple of different panes, the selector pane and the detail pane. The selector pane will not be visible when you're creating objects, and otherwise you can see it or not see it. It's up to you just to hide it or show it. But it allows you to select from various underlying database objects and then to click on them, which loads that object into the detail pane. The detail pane then shows you all the information related to that object, and it is context sensitive, meaning that if you're looking at a table, you'll see details related to tables, whereas if you're looking at another object, such as a sequence or package, you'll see different details related to those objects. The UI defaults allows for a centralized definition of how we'd like to see things in our applications. It's done at a lower level, at the database level. And using the UI defaults is a really important means to promote consistency and really reduce a lot of manual code generation in your applications. Well, what does all that mean? Well, basically you can think of a simple example. Say you have an employees table. Employees table most likely has a department column that links back to a departments table. Now, if you're going to create pages in an application on employees, you probably don't want to have that particular field read department ID. You might want it to just say department. And rather than the end user seeing a number, you might want them to actually see the name of the department, perhaps as a select list or a pop-up list of values. you can actually define how the labels should look, how the item should render on an Apex page in both forms and reports at a lower level. Then when you create a page on that particular database table, it will look up the defaults you've defined at that lower level and use them in the page. Again, just really good. It can save you time over time and promote a lot of consistency in your apps. Let's take a look and explore the object browser a bit. Logging into the Apex workspace. As you can see, I'm on apex.oracle.com. When you first log in, you'll see the main components of Apex. To start with, we're going into the SQL Workshop. The reason I start in the SQL Workshop rather than the application builder is simply because when we build data-centric applications, we need the database done first. So it's actually out of order when you look in the book, but in actuality, this is what we need first. This is the home page for the SQL Workshop. We want to take a look first at the object browser. Drill in on that. And here we have on the left the selection or selector pane, and on the right the detail pane. Now across the top, you'll also notice a schema selector. If this particular workspace was mapped to more than one database schema, you'd be able to select the schema that you're working with here. In this case, it's not, and more than likely, none of your workspaces are mapped to multiple schemas either, but if they were, that's where you would change it. And these little icons here just access the different parts of the SQL Workshop. As I said, the selector pane is used basically to find underlying database objects. We start at the top with the type of object that we're looking at, and you can see there's something for all of the various types of database objects we typically work with. We'll start with tables. These first sets of tables here are related to a new feature or a new type of application in Apex known as web sheets. But you can click on a table, and then you'll see that object load in the detail pane here on the right. Sooner or later. Here we are. So we have a number of tabs across the top here. The first one basically is kind of like a describe on the table. It gives us various information such as column names and their data type, whether or not they accept null. And under that tab, we have a number of buttons. We can add columns, change names, we can drop the table or delete it, do various things of that nature. Switching to the Data tab, you can see that you can both view and edit the data in the database. So you can click on Edit here and make changes to data as well. Not going to go into everything here, but I'll show you a couple of things. The Model tab actually is pretty neat. If you want to see how this table is related to other tables, you can go to the Model tab, which will show you the child and parent tables. It does this using foreign key constraints, and it only goes one level in either direction. So it doesn't traverse the entire hierarchy, but you can get a basic idea of the immediate relationships. So obviously, graphically, we can see and make changes as well. If you come over to Create, go to Create a Table, you go through a wizard that walks you through doing this. One of the things I really like about this is that it doesn't just create a table in some cases, or just the object. The next step here, we're creating a primary key. And we could say no primary key, but if you say that the primary key is populated from a new sequence, then in addition to creating the table itself, it will also create a sequence. You can see that the sequence name is based on the table name, and then they just add the underscore SEQ. When you get to the end here, go through several more steps. We'll just skip through these. You can see you can add foreign keys, define various table level constraints. You get to the end here, and this is what I meant by it actually provides the SQL, so it's both graphical, but it gives you the code as well. Here's the code to create the table, subsequently the sequence, and then look at this. It's also going to create a trigger that will tie the sequence to the table. The way this works, basically on an insert into the table, it'll look at the primary key column to see if it's null. If it's null, it will then use the sequence. We'll select the next value from it and put it into the primary key column. It does all this for you automatically. So a lot of nice features about this tool that you just don't see even in some of the other tools like SQL Dev or Toad. Any questions about the object browser? SQL commands are up next. Basically, you can think of SQL commands as the SQL Plus on the web. You can execute any ad hoc statement against the database you wish. That includes both DML or DDL. There is a feature called auto commit, and you will not see this in apex.oracle.com, but if you were using, say, your own custom system or localhost, you'll see that in the upper right-hand corner. I'll show you where, although we won't see it. Auto commit is important. Basically, if you are doing DML against the database, you can configure whether or not it should be committed when executed. It's not supported in apex.oracle.com. Auto commit is implicit. So if you make any DML changes, know that they are permanent and instant. Okay. There's also a selector that allows you to view more rows. This is important when you're querying data. Just keep in mind that the more rows you view at any one particular point in time, the slower things will work overall. And one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that this is true in the SQL commands part of the SQL Workshop, but it's also true in your own applications. And it really matters quite a good deal depending on your applications and the tables that they're working with. People often say that they need the ability in Apex to see 10,000 rows, 100,000 rows, and so on. That's fine. You can do that. Just keep in mind that there are performance implications and that you will be waiting longer periods of time for that much data. In the SQL commands area, you can also view explain plans, which is actually rather complex functionality that's most often used to tune queries and do like operations. And it's important to note that you can save statements for reuse. There's also a history feature that's working there automatically. It'll save the last 200 statements you execute against the database for you, and you can access that when you need it. Let's take a look. Just going back to the SQL Workshop homepage, this time into the SQL commands window. Here we have the basic window, so you can just type in ad hoc queries. And you can click on Run, or you can hold Control and hit Enter, as I just did. And you can see the statement execute, and you'll see the results down below under the Results tab. As I mentioned, you can also view explain plans. A little complex outside of the scope of this class. Now, describe doesn't just work, as you can see here. It will at least let you know what you need to do. So you basically need to say describe and then the table you'd like described. At that point in time, if I execute this, you can see a description of the table or basic information about it. And this is a lot like using the object browser and then just selecting the object. Like I showed you with a table before, it'll just show you a lot of the same information, really just different ways to get at the same information. Now, if I executed a query and want to pull it back up, I can use the history feature over here. You can see when it was executed. Just click on it, and it'll load it back into the command area. And if you want to save it, rather than depend on the history here, you can save a query. Just give it a name. Hit save, and when you look under the Saved tab, you'll see the query. Here it is, my user report. And when you click on it, it'll just put it back up into the window. If you are working in another environment, the auto commit feature would typically be displayed right here. You'll see a little checkbox for auto commit. In this environment, you just assume it's checked automatically. And here's that row selector I was telling you about. So try to avoid doing too much data at once. These can get you into performance issues. This will obviously just clear out the window. And here we have a flashlight, which opens up this pop-up here. And this can be really useful. Basically, you're seeing tables in the schema. I can click on one, and it'll do a basic describe, but also give us a query that is sort of like a select star from that table, but we get more of the columns. And to add the query to the command area, we just click on one of these two buttons. Append will simply take the query and add it to the bottom of whatever's in there, and replace will replace it all. So a really nice way to avoid having to type that out manually. Question came in about using auto commit. Do I recommend using it? I do, in fact. The reason that it's disabled at apex.oracle.com has to do with some performance implications of not having it enabled, which is why they just implicitly enable it and don't display the options. They have so many users at any given point in time that they can't afford to run that particular feature. The truth of the matter is, if you need the ability to roll back a transaction, I advise you to use a tool such as Toad or SQL Developer, as they're a lot better for that kind of work. The web-based interfaces, just keep it simple, and you shouldn't have any problems. But if you're doing really important things that you might need to roll back, probably best going with a different tool. Any other questions on the SQL Workshop? Okay. Or SQL commands, anyway. Okay, next up, we're going to take a look at the SQL scripts component of the SQL Workshop. We basically use this to execute statements in sets. They're grouped together and comprise a script. You can run these on occasion. A lot of the times you might have a script to bring in, let's say, data into dev. You might have a script to clear out some data or compile various information. They can do a number of things. Really depends on your environment. You can run scripts in this area 2 different ways now in Apex 4.0. The first here is in batch. Basically, you upload the script or create it there, and when you execute it in batch, it's submitted as a background job. So as soon as you hit run in batch, it will start running in the background, but in Apex, you'll go and you'll see the next page, and you can continue doing whatever it is you need to do, and it'll just finish on its own. That's typically how you're going to want to run a job that takes a while to go. However, sometimes if the job doesn't take very long, you might just want to wait on it a little bit and then immediately see the results afterward. That's new in Apex 4. You can do that now. Just click Now, and it'll sort of stay on the same page and take you to the results page when it finishes running. You can create scripts within the SQL scripts component of the SQL Workshop. It's certainly possible. There's a built-in editor. It's not as capable as what you'd have with a local client, such as Toad or SQL Developer. So if you have access to those tools, I recommend you use them. Even tools like Notepad++ or something like that can be a little bit better than the online editor. But it is there if you need it. Let's take a look. Back to the SQL Workshop homepage, this time into SQL Scripts. And you can see I have a script already in here. Just going to clear that out. So this is usually what you see when you first come in here. And as I said, you can click on Create, and you have this editor here, and it will even do some basic syntax highlighting for you. You can see the Create here just turned blue, but not the best editor. So what I typically do is create the scripts outside and then upload them. You can select from any of the files on your local machine. Now, what we have here, I'm in the student files that everybody should have access to at this point. And the one I'm uploading here is setup event tracker objects.sql. That's a SQL script. I'll upload that. Now, once the script has been uploaded, we can view it. You can see how many times it was run and when it was last run or updated and things like that. We could click here to run it or click here to edit it. I'll show you what it looks like in the SQL editor here. Actually, let's take a look at the script, see what it's doing. We'll be working with this as part of the workshop after this lesson. The first series of statements here just drop any existing objects, and following that we go ahead and create them. Of course, the first time you run this script, these dropped statements may give you problems. And you can see it's just creating some objects and some sequences, some of those triggers, and subsequently inserting some data, some sample data into those tables. From here, I'll go to Run, and it parses the script. At this point, if there were any lines in the script that basically were not applicable to the web, such as show errors, it would let you know here because you won't see that output. And click on Run Now to wait, see the results. To actually see the results, we're at the Manage Results here. We have to drill down by clicking View Results here. And we can see everything that was executed and what the feedback was. Simple enough. Any questions about the SQL scripts? Okay. Next part that we want to take a look at is the query builder. Basically, when you're new to SQL, this is a fantastic tool to put together various queries that you can later use in Apex. And I'll show you how you can save them and then take advantage of them later. You don't need to have knowledge of SQL to use this tool, but knowledge of SQL, of course, will help you use this tool, and eventually you may get to the point where you're comfortable writing SQL queries without this tool. Like the object browser, it has different panes, in this case 3 main panes. The selector pane works like it did with the previous tool. And then we also have the design pane and the output pane. I'll show you how all those work. Basically, you use the selector pane to select an object, which adds that object to the design pane. You use the design pane to then establish links or joins between the tables, and you can select the columns you would like to include in the query. Then you can use the output pane for a number of things, including specifying various conditions or predicates, sorting, and things of that nature. The table actions is an easy way to join tables that uses the foreign key relationships between them. So keep that in mind. If you don't want to do that manually, you can always use the table actions. Finally, once you've created your query, you can then execute it. If it looks good, everything's all right, you can save it and later use it in both the SQL commands area that we previously saw, or in your applications. Let's take a look. Okay, drilling down into the query builder, we have a number of tables here. So let's say we wanted to build up a report on orders. I can select the orders table, and once you click on it, you can see it'll load it into here, and you can see the columns we have available as well. There's one here that relates to the customer table. Now, if I don't include another table and I just run this, we get nothing now. I'm going to add a couple columns. We'll run it again. And this is the data you get back. You can even click on the SQL tab here to see the query that it's generating for us. Now, if in the requirements you needed to see the customer name, you could do that by including the customer table. So I'll click on that here. And we have the two tables. What you need to do is join the two tables together. Now, in the upper left-hand corner of each table is where you see the table actions. And if I click that, you'll see a menu. Takes just a little bit. This is using Ajax, basically, to query the data dictionary. And obviously, we have a rather large data dictionary on apex.oracle.com. Give it just a few more seconds. If it comes back, great. If not, we'll move on. All right, we'll go ahead and move on. Or not. There we go. Okay, so here we can basically select or I should say establish a foreign key relationship with another table using the foreign keys that are on the table. In this case, I've already added the other table I want to join to. So I'm going to show you a different way to join, which is simply to click in this right column here, and then where you want to join to on the other table here. And you can see it adds this join link in between. You can click on that to get a menu here. You can delete the join or set it to a left or right outer join. Outer joins are something you would learn about in a basic course on SQL. So once we have the join established, we can include some information from the other table. If we view the SQL, you can see that it's getting a bit more complex now, and we can run it to see the results of the join. Now, when we have the query as we want it, in this case, maybe we would need to see the first name after the last name, and we want the names to be on the left. We can come over to the first part here, conditions, and reorder things. So if I want last name to be moved up, and then first name up as well, we can do that. We can specify aliases for our columns and do different predicates or filters and sorting and so on. So if I run this now, we can see it's the way we want it. And once it's the way you want it, you can save it. Call this one My Orders 2. Now, here's My Orders 2. Once I've saved it, I can actually go into the SQL commands area. And under Saved SQL, I'll see the query here. But the reverse is not true. Notice that I can see a query that was created in the query builder here. But if I go back to the query builder and I looked under Save SQL, I don't see queries that were generated under the SQL commands window. And the reason for that is the SQL that's generated here by the query builder. If you take a look at it, it's a very specific format, and it has to be in this format to work. That's why it doesn't go both ways. Okay, any questions about the query builder? All right. Finally, there's a utilities component within the SQL Workshop. Lots of different tools that we can take advantage of here, but all of them we usually don't see. The reason for that, or actually we'll see them, but we simply don't have access to them. The reason is that they require DBA access. Of course, we don't have that access here in apex.oracle.com. You may or may not have it in your dev environments at work or other environments. But typically we just don't use those. One of the really big features here is the ability to import and export data. It's actually not just data. You can move definitions for your objects and things like that. So if you need to migrate an application from, say, development to test to production, there are lots of tools in here to help you with that. Another major component is the UI defaults. So I've talked a little bit about those before. Basically the ability to define how something should render in your application, but rather than do it repeatedly in the application via configuration at that level, you can define this one time at the database level and then leverage that over and over in your applications. New in Apex 4.0, there are some abilities to do synchronization between the database and the UI defaults, which didn't exist previously. We also now have in 4.0 this attribute dictionary. Basically, this is even more generic than table defaults. So if a table default has been used, then it will take precedence over an attribute dictionary default. What does all that mean? So let's say there is a very common column called customer ID in all of your tables. Well, if you use a table level user interface default and you rename it, configure how it should look, then that will be used over a generic attribute level default for the same title of a column. So two different ways to do it, but one takes precedence over the other. See how it all works. So finally, we'll go into the last component here, the utilities area. Let me actually go back. In the SQL Workshop, if you look over here, there's various utilities here. These utilities are the same utilities that we see in here, just a different way to access them. Question came in, if we modify your query on the SQL tab, would it update your graphical view? If we modify the query in the SQL tab, no. If oh, I see where you're going with that. So that's a great question. The truth is I do not have the right answer. So let's take a look. If I pull up a query here, and let's say we remove the customer ID, and I save it, we use the same name, no, it will not work like that. So I guess the queries that are defined in the query builder must be maintained from the query builder. You cannot overwrite them from here. Okay, so going back, the utilities are also listed here, but we can drill in here and see them listed out. The Data Workshop is where you can load or unload data in a variety of formats, as you see. We can run object reports, just all kinds of reports to run on your various database objects. Generate DDL, very powerful tool for your migrations, your deployments. Basically, you'll need to create a script that creates some of the objects you create in your dev environments in a different environment, and you can do that from here. Select the types of objects you'd like to export, and you can even specify exactly which ones and then generate the DDL. And that DDL can either be displayed in line where you can copy and paste it, or it can generate a script file for you. User interface defaults, we'll take a look here. So again, we have the attribute and the table dictionaries. we'll go into the table dictionary, and you can see that we have 3 tables that have some user interface defaults defined. We'll take a look at the demo customers. So here we have columns like first name and last name. These are the actual column names in the table. And in this case, maybe cost, we wouldn't want to have displayed in our various forms and reports. Maybe just first name is what we want. So you can drill down on first name here and make the change. These are sort of general defaults. Then we have form and report, and then list of values. So at the general level, I'm just changing the label. We can also define help text, which users can click on a label and get help for it. We can set the form defaults. Text field is right in this case. I can adjust the width and the maximum width fields, make it required or not, do different things like that, and do the same kinds of things for the report. Don't have a good foreign key relationship here. Let me move to a different table. Okay, orders, for example. Orders here has a customer ID. So when we generate a report or form on this particular table, it would create a field for us that says customer ID. It would be a number field, which is somewhat accurate, but we're then expecting our end users to know all of the departments by heart. It might be a little bit better to clean this up some. Make this just say customer. Flip this so that it's a select list. And when we have a select list, notice that if I try to save this, it's telling me it requires a list of values be defined. So that's important. We'll need to do that. I'll go back in. And down here, you can define your list of values. Excuse me, I'm getting a question. What tool would we use to move Apex code from a dev box to test and then subsequently to production? We will be covering that actually toward the end of class, but just to give you an idea now, your Apex application is really, at least 99% of the time, just a collection of metadata in the database in those tables in the Apex hierarchy I was telling you about before. So to move an application from one environment to the next, you need to move the metadata. And the way we do that in Apex is we export our application, which gives us a script file, essentially. It's a SQL script, which will perform all of the inserts necessary in a different environment. So we export our application and create a script file, and then we import that script file in the next environment. That's the gist of it, but we'll cover it a little bit more later. So here we can define a list of values query. A list of values query is a query that has 2 columns involved. What we want to display to the end user and what should be returned. And in this case, we're working with customers, so we probably want to display the name but return the ID. Okay, so you could just type in the query if you knew it here. I really don't. I think that's right. This would be the display, the first part, or the first column. And the second would be the return. I think it's custom. If you don't know the query, you can use the query builder. It'll open up a pop-up. You can just click on the table and generate the query from here. Customer ID. So once you do this, you can reuse those defaults then in your forms or reports in Apex. Going back to the user interface defaults and looking at the more generic attribute dictionary. So here we would say that we have lots of tables that have a similar column name or the same column name, in this case customer ID. And if you find a table, if we're creating a form or report on a table with a column of this name, then go ahead and use this label and use these attributes. As you can see, they're not as specific as those used at the table level, and those defined at the table level will override these, but you can at least do some things here as well. We have a recycle bin. Basically, the way this works, Oracle, in the case of certain database objects like tables, when you drop them, they don't necessarily get deleted. They go into a recycle bin, which is a bit like the Microsoft recycle bin we're all familiar with in Windows. You can both view objects that have been dropped, you can drill down on them, and even bring them back out of the recycle bin. It's a bit more complex than that in reality, but what's great about it is that when you drop a table and you've done that by mistake, it's not necessarily gone. You have not necessarily lost all the information. Now, the longer you leave that table in drop state, the more likely that you will indeed lose it eventually. Two ways that this gets cleared out. You either manually clear it out, which is done via the purge option here, or you can leave objects there, but eventually they'll sort of phase themselves out automatically. Exactly when, it can vary, but typically the way it works is that you have, in a schema, you have a table space, which is a physical layer, and table spaces can grow to a certain size before they extend. And as you approach the size limit, basically it will try to squeeze more information in. When it can't fit anymore, it will drop objects permanently that are in the recycle bin and that have not been dropped. So there's no real guarantee time-wise as to how long an object will remain there, but oftentimes they remain there for quite a bit. Depends on the way your data moves, which in dev is not usually as fast as it'd be in production. Okay, Database Monitor is a good example of one of those tools we just can't really use. As soon as you try to get into it, it's going to ask you for a DBA login. You'd have to have a DBA role like sys with sysdba, which we simply don't have in this environment.